Have you ever wondered what people actually ate during the darkest periods of human history? Well, buckle up, because what I'm about to show you will make you grateful for every single meal you've ever had. Picture this. You're sitting down to what passes for dinner in medieval Europe. There's no refrigeration, no food safety standards, and absolutely no concept of what we'd consider basic hygiene. The smell hits you first, a mixture of rotting meat, fermented grain, and something you can't quite identify but desperately wish you could forget. This was reality for millions of people. For over 1,000 years. Most people think medieval food was just bland and boring. Peasants eating gruel, nobles feasting on roasted meat. That's the sanitized version you see in movies. But the truth? The actual truth about what people consumed during the Middle Ages will shock you to your core. We're talking about foods so revolting, so absolutely vile, that they would be considered biological weapons by today's standards. In this video, I'm going to take you on a journey through the most disgusting, horrifying, and downright nauseating foods that our ancestors not only ate, but actually sought out as delicacies. And trust me, by the end of this series, you'll understand why the average medieval person lived to the ripe old age of 35. But here's what makes this even more disturbing. These weren't just desperate survival foods eaten during famines. These were regular menu items, festival foods, and yes, even luxury dishes served at royal banquets. I've spent months researching medieval cookbooks, archaeological findings, and historical accounts to bring you the most comprehensive look at medieval cuisine that no food historian wants to talk about. Now, before we dive into this culinary nightmare, I need to warn you, some of what you're about to hear might genuinely make you sick. I'm not exaggerating for effect here. These foods were so revolting that even by medieval standards, people often got violently ill from eating them, so if you have a weak stomach, maybe grab a bucket, you're going to need it. Let's start with something that sounds innocent enough, medieval bread. You're probably thinking, how bad could bread be? Well, medieval bread wasn't the fluffy, golden loaves you're imagining. Most common bread was made from whatever grain was available, and I mean whatever. Barley, oats, peas, beans, and when times got really tough, sawdust, ground bark, and even clay were mixed into the dough, but here's where it gets truly disgusting. Medieval bakers regularly added something called grout to their bread. Grout was a mixture of herbs that included things like bog myrtle, yarrow, and wild rosemary. Sounds harmless, right? Wrong. These herbs were often collected from swamps and bogs where they absorbed all sorts of bacteria and parasites. The bread literally crawled with worms and insects that had been baked right into the loaf. And that's not even the worst part. The ovens used to bake this bread were communal and rarely cleaned. Layers of grease, ash, and decomposing organic matter built up over months or even years. The bread absorbed all of these flavours, creating a taste that contemporary accounts describe as like eating the devil's own vomit. But wait, it gets worse, much worse. Medieval people had a dish called mortrue, and the name should be your first clue that this isn't going to be pleasant. Mortrue was essentially a stew made from whatever meat was available, but here's the catch. The meat was often so rotten that it had to be boiled for hours just to kill the most obvious bacteria. We're talking about meat that was green, covered in maggots, and gave off a smell so putrid that it could be detected from streets away. The cooking process for mortrue involved throwing chunks of this decomposing meat into a pot with whatever vegetables could be scrounged up. These vegetables were often mouldy turnips, blackened onions, and cabbage that had been stored in underground pits for months. The whole mixture was then seasoned with herbs that were supposed to mask the taste of decay, but really just added new dimensions of awfulness to an already horrific meal. Contemporary cookbooks actually give specific instructions for preparing rotten meat. One manuscript from the 14th century advises cooks to boil the meat until the green colour fades to brown, then add honey to sweeten the corruption. They knew the meat was rotten. They knew it was dangerous. They ate it anyway because the alternative was starvation. Now let's talk about medieval fish. You might think fish would be safer than meat. given that it spoils more obviously. You'd be wrong. Medieval people had something called stockfish, fish that was dried without salt in the open air for months. By the time it was ready to eat, stockfish had the texture of leather and a smell that could knock you unconscious. But stockfish was considered a luxury compared to what most people actually ate. Common folk consumed something called poor man's salmon, which wasn't salmon at all. It was carp that had been left to rot in barrels of its own waste for weeks. The fermentation process created a fish paste that was spread on bread like butter. The smell was so intense that it was banned from being prepared inside city limits in many medieval towns. The preparation of poor man's salmon involved catching carp from rivers and streams that were already contaminated with human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from tanneries and dye works. These fish were then gutted, sort of, and packed into barrels with their own intestines and whatever other fish parts were lying around. The barrels were sealed and left in the sun for weeks, while the contents fermented into what can only be described as liquid nightmare fuel. Medieval dairy products deserve their own special category of horror. Without pasteurization or proper storage, milk products became vehicles for every disease imaginable. Medieval cheese was often made from milk that was already sour, and the aging process took place in caves or cellars that were also used as latrines. One particularly revolting medieval delicacy was called maggot cheese. This wasn't cheese that accidentally got infested with maggots. This was cheese that was intentionally exposed to flies so that maggots would grow inside it. The maggots were considered essential to the flavour, and the cheese was eaten with the live maggots still wriggling around inside. Contemporary accounts describe the experience as like chewing on tiny squirming pieces of fat that burst in your mouth. But even regular medieval cheese was horrifying by modern standards. It was made in conditions that would shut down any modern dairy operation instantly. Milk was collected in unwashed containers, often contaminated with manure and other substances I won't describe. The cheese-making process involved adding rennet that came from the stomachs of dead animals that had often died from disease. The aging process made everything worse. Cheese wheels were stored in damp, mouldy environments where they developed thick crusts of fungi and bacteria. This crust wasn't removed before eating. It was considered part of the delicacy. The inside of the cheese was often riddled with holes that weren't from proper aging, but from insect larvae that had burrowed through the entire wheel. Medieval beverages weren't any better. Water was so contaminated that even medieval people knew it was dangerous to drink. So instead, they drank ale and wine that were made under conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. Medieval ale was brewed in containers that were never properly cleaned, often using water from sources that were visibly contaminated with sewage and dead animals. The brewing process involved adding ingredients that seem innocent until you learn how they were prepared. Hops were often mouldy and infested with insects. Grain was frequently contaminated with ergot, a fungus that causes hallucinations, convulsions, and sometimes death. The fermentation vessels were wooden barrels that had been used for everything from storing salted meat to holding human waste. But here's what makes medieval ale truly disgusting. It was often flavoured with herbs and spices that had been stored in conditions that encouraged the growth of deadly bacteria. These flavourings included things like wormwood, which is mildly poisonous, and various roots and berries that had been dried without any understanding of food safety. The ale itself had a thick, chunky consistency that came from incomplete fermentation and the presence of organic matter that should never have been in the brew in the first place. Contemporary accounts describe medieval ale as having chunks of unknown origin floating in it, and a taste that was sour, bitter, and reminiscent of decay. Now let's move on to what medieval people considered fancy cuisine, the food served at noble banquets and royal feasts. You might think that rich people ate better, but you'd be wrong. Wealth didn't buy food safety in the Middle Ages, it just bought more elaborate ways to poison yourself. Medieval nobles had access to exotic spices and rare ingredients, but these items often travelled for months without proper preservation. Spices arrived mouldy and contaminated, but they were so expensive that they were used anyway. The mould and bacteria were simply considered part of the exotic flavour profile. One popular noble dish was called blancmange, which sounds elegant until you learn what it actually contained. Blancmange was made from chicken that had been boiled until it fell apart, then mixed with rice that had been stored in damp conditions for months. The mixture was coloured white, using ground almonds that were often rancid and bitter from improper storage. But the real horror of medieval noble cuisine was the obsession with elaborate presentation over food safety. Dishes were designed to impress guests with their complexity and visual appeal, regardless of whether they were safe to eat. Meat was sculpted into fantastic shapes and then left sitting for hours while other courses were prepared. By the time these artistic creations reached the table, they were breeding grounds for every pathogen imaginable. The cooking methods used in noble kitchens were just as dangerous as those used by common people. But on a larger scale, massive fireplaces were used to roast entire animals, but the heat distribution was so uneven that parts of the meat remained raw, while other parts were charred beyond recognition. The raw sections harboured bacteria and parasites, while the overcooked portions were carcinogenic and nearly inedible. Medieval feast preparation involved dozens of cooks working in kitchens that had no ventilation, no refrigeration, and no understanding of cross-contamination. Raw meat was prepared on the same surfaces as cooked food. Vegetables were washed in water that was already contaminated with animal waste. Utensils were shared between different dishes without any cleaning in between. The serving process was equally horrifying. Food was carried from the kitchens to the dining halls by servants who had no concept of hygiene. These servants often had open wounds, skin diseases, and other conditions that they spread to the food they handled. The platters and serving dishes were rarely cleaned properly, so each meal was contaminated with remnants from previous feasts. But perhaps the most disgusting aspect of medieval noble dining was the practice of sharing everything. Multiple people ate from the same bowl, drank from the same cup, and tore pieces from the same loaf of bread. Diseases spread rapidly through these shared meals, and it was common for entire dinner parties to fall ill simultaneously from food poisoning. The entertainment at these feasts often made the food situation even worse. Performers, musicians, and jesters moved freely through the dining area, bringing with them all the dirt, disease, and contamination from their travels. Animals were sometimes brought into the dining hall as part of the entertainment, adding their own contribution to the already unsanitary conditions. And this is just the beginning of our journey through medieval culinary horror. We haven't even touched on the truly exotic delicacies that medieval people sought out specifically because they were rare and difficult to obtain. We haven't discussed the seasonal foods that were only available during certain times of year and had to be preserved using methods that would make your skin crawl. We haven't explored the underground markets where desperate people sold foods that were literally crawling with life, or the religious festivals where consuming disgusting substances was considered a holy act. The rabbit hole of medieval food horror goes so much deeper than you could possibly imagine. Let's talk about preserved meats, because if you thought fresh rotten meat was bad, wait until you hear about what medieval people did to make meat last through the winter. They had a preservation method called confit, but this wasn't the elegant French cooking technique you might know today. Medieval confit involved submerging chunks of meat in barrels filled with animal fat that had been rendered from creatures that had died of disease. The fat used for preservation came from pigs, cows, and sheep that had succumbed to various plagues and infections. This diseased fat was melted down in huge cauldrons, often without removing the infected tissue first. The result was a preservation medium that was essentially liquid disease. Meat preserved in this way could last for months, but at what cost? The preserved meat developed a texture that contemporary accounts describe as slippery and unnaturally soft. When removed from the fat, it left behind chunks of unidentifiable material and gave off vapours that made people's eyes water and throats burn. But here's the truly revolting part. The fat itself was considered a delicacy. People would spread this disease-laden grease on bread and eat it as a treat. Medieval sausages represent perhaps the pinnacle of culinary horror from this era. These weren't the carefully regulated meat products we know today. Medieval sausage making was an exercise in creative disposal of animal parts that couldn't be used for anything else. We're talking about intestines filled with ground-up organs, bones, cartilage, and meat that was too rotten to sell as regular cuts. The casings for these sausages were animal intestines that hadn't been properly cleaned. They still contained digestive matter, parasites, and bacteria from the original animal. The stuffing process involved cramming this mixture of decomposing animal parts into these contaminated casings using tools that were never sanitized. But here's what makes medieval sausages truly nightmarish. They were often made from multiple species of animals mixed together. Pork, beef, horse, dog, cat, and sometimes even human remains all went into the same grinding process. There was no quality control, no inspection, and certainly no concern about what diseases these different animals might have been carrying. The smoking and curing process for these sausages took place in chimneys and outbuildings that were also used for other purposes. The smoke came from burning whatever was available, often including garbage, human waste, and the bones of diseased animals. This toxic smoke infused the sausages with compounds that were carcinogenic and poisonous. Let's move on to medieval eggs, because surely eggs would be relatively safe, right? Wrong again. Medieval chickens lived in conditions that would make modern factory farms look like luxury resorts. These birds were kept in tiny spaces where they wallowed in their own filth, ate garbage and carrion, and suffered from diseases that affected the quality of their eggs. Medieval eggs were often partially developed when they were harvested. People regularly ate eggs that contained partially formed chicks, complete with beaks, feathers, and tiny bones. This wasn't considered unusual or disgusting by medieval standards. It was just part of eating eggs. The texture was described as crunchy and chewy at the same time, with flavours that ranged from metallic to putrid. But even regular eggs were problematic. Without proper storage, eggs went bad quickly, but they were still consumed long after they had spoiled. Rotten eggs were often mixed with good ones in dishes where the bad smell could be masked with strong spices. Medieval cooks developed elaborate techniques for disguising the taste and smell of spoiled eggs, but they never developed techniques for making them safe to eat. The preservation of eggs involved methods that seemed designed to maximize contamination. Eggs were stored in sawdust, ash, or clay that was often contaminated with animal waste and other organic matter. These preservation materials weren't changed regularly, so they became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that infected the eggs they were supposed to protect. Medieval soups and stews deserve special mention in our catalogue of culinary horrors. These weren't the comforting, nourishing broths you might imagine. Medieval soup making involved throwing whatever was available into a pot and boiling it until it was soft enough to swallow. The ingredients included vegetable scraps that were rotting, bones from diseased animals, and water that was visibly contaminated. One particularly revolting soup was called pottage, which was essentially a thin gruel made from whatever grain could be found, mixed with scraps of meat and vegetables. The cooking process involved letting this mixture simmer for days or even weeks, adding new ingredients as they became available. The pot was never fully emptied or cleaned, so layers of old, decomposing food built up at the bottom. The smell of pottage was so strong that it could be detected from considerable distances. Medieval accounts describe it as a mixture of decay, fermentation, and something indescribably foul. The texture was described as slippery and lumpy, with chunks of unidentifiable material floating throughout. But pottage was considered luxury food compared to what the truly desperate ate. During times of famine, people made soup from leather boots, tree bark, and even human hair. These weren't just survival foods eaten in extreme circumstances. They were regular parts of the diet for the poorest members of medieval society. The cooking vessels used for these soups were rarely cleaned properly. Iron pots developed thick layers of rust and organic buildup that flavoured everything cooked in them. Wooden bowls absorbed liquids and odours from previous meals, creating a cumulative effect of increasing nastiness over time. Now let's discuss medieval vegetables, because plant-based foods had their own special category of disgusting. Medieval agriculture involved growing crops in soil that was fertilised exclusively with human and animal waste. There was no understanding of composting or safe fertilisation practices, so fresh manure was applied directly to growing plants. The vegetables that grew in these conditions were often contaminated with parasites and bacteria from the fertiliser. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots absorbed these contaminants through their skins, while leafy vegetables like cabbage trapped bacteria and parasite eggs in their leaves and stems. Medieval people had a particular fondness for something called white beet, which was essentially a turnip that had been stored underground for so long that it had turned completely white and developed a slimy texture. These vegetables were often partially decomposed by the time they were eaten, with soft spots that contained concentrations of bacteria and mould. The preservation of vegetables involved techniques that seemed designed to maximise their disgusting potential. Cabbage was fermented in barrels with its own leaves and whatever other organic matter was available. The fermentation process created an acidic environment that preserved the cabbage but also produced compounds that smelled like sulphur and tasted like vinegar mixed with decay. Onions were stored in pits lined with straw and covered with dirt. These storage pits often flooded with contaminated water, creating perfect conditions for bacterial growth. The onions absorbed water and bacteria through their skins, developing soft black spots that were eaten along with the rest of the vegetable. Medieval people also ate what they called hedge fruits, berries and other wild fruits that grew along roadsides and in areas contaminated with human and animal waste. These fruits were often overripe to the point of fermentation, with textures that ranged from mushy to liquid. They were frequently infested with insects and larvae, but this was considered normal and even beneficial for the flavour. Let's talk about medieval cooking methods, because the way food was prepared was often just as disgusting as the ingredients themselves. Medieval kitchens were environments that would shut down any modern restaurant instantly. They had no ventilation, no refrigeration, and no understanding of basic food safety principles. Cooking fires were fueled with whatever was available, including dried animal dung, garbage, and sometimes human waste. The smoke from these fires infused food with compounds that were toxic and carcinogenic. The ashes from these fires often fell directly into the food during cooking, adding gritty textures and bitter flavours. Cooking utensils were rarely cleaned properly and were often made from materials that weren't food safe. Wooden spoons absorbed flavours and bacteria from previous meals, while metal implements developed rust and corrosion that flavoured everything they touched. Cooking pots were shared between different types of food without any cleaning in between. The cooking process itself often involved techniques that maximised contamination. Raw meat was prepared on surfaces that were also used for cooked food. Vegetables were washed in water that was already contaminated with animal waste and food scraps. Different ingredients were mixed together without any understanding of how their various bacteria and parasites might interact. Medieval cooks had no understanding of proper cooking temperatures or food safety timing. Meat was often served raw in the centre, while being charred on the outside. Vegetables were either overcooked to the point of complete breakdown, or served completely raw with all their surface contamination intact. But perhaps the most disgusting aspect of medieval cooking was the complete lack of personal hygiene among the people preparing the food. Cooks worked with open wounds, skin diseases, and other conditions that they spread to everything they touched. They rarely washed their hands, and when they did, it was in water that was already contaminated with food scraps and other organic matter. The serving of food was equally horrifying. Meals were often left sitting for hours between preparation and consumption, giving bacteria plenty of time to multiply. Food was served on platters and in bowls that hadn't been properly cleaned, so each meal was contaminated with remnants from previous meals. Medieval dining practices ensured that diseases spread rapidly through communities. People shared eating utensils, drank from common cups, and tore pieces from shared loaves of bread. Saliva, blood, and other bodily fluids were regularly exchanged during meals, creating perfect conditions for the transmission of infectious diseases. And we're still just scratching the surface of medieval food horror. We haven't even begun to explore the truly exotic delicacies that medieval people sought out specifically because they were rare and revolting. We haven't discussed the seasonal celebrations where consuming disgusting foods was considered essential for good luck and prosperity. We haven't talked about the travelling merchants who sold mysterious substances that claimed to be food but were actually combinations of chemicals, animal parts, and organic matter that defied classification. We haven't explored the underground markets where desperate people traded in foods that were so dangerous they were banned from legitimate commerce. The depths of medieval culinary horror continue to reveal themselves the more we dig into historical records and archaeological evidence. Every new discovery seems to confirm that our ancestors lived in a world where every meal was a potential death sentence, and where survival often meant consuming things that would be considered biological warfare by modern standards. The religious aspect of medieval dining adds another layer of absolute horror to our story. The Catholic Church had strict rules about what could be eaten during different times of the year, and these restrictions led to some truly revolting workarounds that make everything we've discussed so far seem almost appetizing. During Lent, when meat was forbidden, medieval people turned to what they called mock meats, and these weren't the plant-based alternatives you might imagine. These were elaborate constructions made from fish parts, organ meat, and other substances that technically weren't considered meat by church law, but were infinitely more disgusting than any regular meat dish. One particularly vile Lenten specialty was called fish sausage, which involved grinding up whole fish, bones, scales, eyes and all, and stuffing the paste into cleaned fish bladders. The fermentation process that followed created a product that smelled like low tide, mixed with rotting garbage, and had the texture of wet sand mixed with rubber. But here's where it gets even more disturbing. These religious food restrictions created a black market for substances that could fool church inspectors. Merchants sold powders and pastes made from ground insects, tree fungi, and other organic matter that could be shaped and coloured to resemble forbidden foods. The ingredients in these fake foods were often more dangerous than the real thing, but people consumed them anyway to satisfy their cravings. Medieval monasteries, which you might think would have higher food standards due to their religious nature, were actually some of the worst offenders when it came to disgusting cuisine. Monks lived in closed communities where diseases spread rapidly, and their communal dining practices ensured that every illness was shared among the entire community. Monastery kitchens were often located in basements or underground chambers where moisture and mould were constant problems. The bread baked in these environments developed thick coatings of fungus that weren't removed before eating. They were considered part of God's natural bounty. The wine used for communion was often so contaminated with bacteria that it caused violent stomach ailments, but drinking it was considered a holy duty. Medieval medical theory made the food situation even worse because doctors actually prescribed foods that we now know are dangerous. Physicians believed that certain combinations of rotten foods could cure diseases, leading to treatments that involved consuming mixtures of spoiled meat, fermented vegetables, and toxic herbs. One popular medical treatment involved eating something called theriac, which was supposed to be a cure-all medicine. Theriac contained over 60 ingredients, including viper's flesh, opium, and various herbs that had been aged until they were completely decomposed. The preparation process took months and involved multiple stages of fermentation that created compounds that were both poisonous and hallucinogenic. Doctors prescribed rotten foods as treatments for specific ailments. Mouldy bread was considered good for wounds. Spoiled milk was thought to cure stomach problems, and meat that was crawling with maggots was prescribed for various infections. These medical foods were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to cure. The preparation of medical foods involved techniques that seemed designed to maximize their toxicity. Ingredients were mixed in containers that had been used for other purposes, often without any cleaning in between. The aging process took place in environments that encouraged the growth of dangerous bacteria and fungi. Medieval people also believed that consuming disgusting foods could bring them closer to God through suffering. Religious fanatics would seek out the most revolting substances available and consume them as acts of penance. These included things like rancid oil mixed with dirt, fermented animal blood, and pastes made from human waste and organic matter. Let's talk about medieval baby food, because if you thought adult food was bad, the things fed to infants and children will make you question how anyone survived to adulthood. Medieval people had no understanding of infant nutrition, and the foods they gave to babies were often more dangerous than what adults consumed. Infants were fed something called pap, which was essentially bread that had been chewed by adults and then spit into the baby's mouth. This practice ensured that every disease and infection present in the adult's mouth was transmitted directly to the infant. The bread used for pap was often mouldy and contaminated, and the saliva used to soften it added additional bacteria and parasites. When mothers couldn't breastfeed, babies were given animal milk that had been stored in containers made from animal stomachs. These containers weren't cleaned properly and often contained residual digestive matter from the original animal. The milk stored in these containers developed thick layers of bacteria and mould that were fed to infants, along with the milk itself. Medieval people also fed babies something called caudle, which was a mixture of ale, eggs, and spices that was supposed to be nutritious. The ale used in caudle was often contaminated with ergot and other toxic substances, while the eggs were frequently spoiled or partially developed. The spices were mouldy and bitter from improper storage, creating a mixture that was both disgusting and dangerous. Weaning foods for older infants included porridges made from grain that had been stored in damp conditions for months. These grains were often infested with insects and contaminated with mould, but they were considered appropriate food for children. The cooking process involved boiling these contaminated grains in water that was already polluted with organic matter. Children were also given bone broth made from the bones of diseased animals. The cooking process involved boiling these infected bones for hours, creating a liquid that was concentrated with whatever diseases the original animals had been carrying. This broth was considered especially nutritious for growing children, despite its obvious dangers. The feeding utensils used for babies and children were rarely cleaned properly, and were often made from materials that weren't safe for food contact. Wooden spoons absorbed bacteria and food particles from previous feedings, while metal implements developed rust and corrosion that was ingested along with the food. Medieval pregnancy foods deserve their own special mention in our catalogue of horrors. Pregnant women were encouraged to eat foods that were supposed to benefit their unborn children, but these foods were often more dangerous than anything else in the medieval diet. Expectant mothers were told to consume large quantities of something called blood pudding, which was made from fresh animal blood mixed with grain and spices. The blood used in these puddings came from animals that had often died from disease, and the preparation process involved no safety measures to prevent contamination. Pregnant women also consumed birth ale, a fermented beverage that was supposed to ease labour pains. Birth ale was made from grains that had been contaminated with ergot, a fungus that can cause violent contractions and other complications during childbirth. The fermentation process concentrated these toxic compounds, making birth ale one of the most dangerous substances in the medieval diet. Another pregnancy food was placenta pie, which was exactly what it sounds like: human placenta baked into a pastry crust. This practice was based on the belief that consuming placenta would prevent complications during future pregnancies. The preparation involved no safety measures, and the placenta was often partially decomposed by the time it was cooked. Medieval funeral foods represent perhaps the most disturbing category of all, because these were foods specifically prepared for consumption during and after burial ceremonies. The preparation of these foods involved ingredients and methods that seemed designed to honour the dead by creating substances that were as close to death as possible while still being technically edible. Funeral bread was made from grain that had been stored in crypts and burial chambers, where it absorbed the moisture and vapours from decomposing bodies. This bread had a distinctive flavour that contemporary accounts describe as earthy and sweet with undertones of decay. The preparation process involved grinding this contaminated grain and mixing it with water that had been blessed in the same burial chambers. Wake ale was brewed specifically for funeral gatherings using ingredients that had been aged in burial grounds. The hops and grain used in wake ale were often mouldy and contaminated with substances from the burial environment. The fermentation process took place in containers that had been used for funeral preparations, adding additional flavours of death and decay. Mourning meat was prepared from animals that had been slaughtered specifically for funeral feasts. These animals were often sick or dying when they were killed, as healthy animals were too valuable to waste on funeral food. The meat was prepared using methods that emphasised its connection to death, including aging processes that allowed controlled decomposition to occur. The serving of funeral foods involved rituals that ensured maximum contamination. Food was passed from person to person without any cleaning of hands or utensils in between. Mourners were expected to consume these foods regardless of their condition or safety, as refusing funeral food was considered disrespectful to the dead. Medieval seasonal celebrations created temporary markets for foods that were so disgusting they were only consumed during specific festivals. These celebration foods were often more revolting than everyday medieval cuisine because their preparation was part of the festive ritual rather than a necessity for survival. Harvest festivals featured foods made from the first fruits and vegetables of the season, but these early crops were often unripe, bitter, and contaminated with whatever substances had been used to encourage their growth. Festival breads were made from new grain that hadn't been properly aged, creating products that were difficult to digest and often caused violent stomach ailments. Winter solstice celebrations involved consuming preserved foods that had been stored since the previous harvest. By midwinter, these preserved foods had often spoiled despite the preservation efforts, but they were consumed anyway as part of the seasonal ritual. The spoilage was often considered part of the authentic flavour profile that connected celebrants to the cycle of death and rebirth. Spring festivals featured foods made from the first wild plants and herbs of the growing season. These early plants were often toxic or bitter from growing in contaminated soil, but they were consumed as symbols of renewal and rebirth. The preparation of spring festival foods involved no safety measures, as the consumption of potentially dangerous plants was part of the ritual experience. Religious feast days created markets for exotic foods that were imported from distant locations without any preservation or safety measures. These imported foods often arrived completely spoiled after months of travel, but they were consumed anyway because of their rarity and religious significance. Medieval wedding foods represent another category of ritualized consumption of disgusting substances. Wedding feasts were supposed to demonstrate prosperity and abundance, but the foods served at these celebrations were often more dangerous than everyday meals because of the elaborate preparation methods and the pressure to create impressive displays. Wedding cakes were made from ingredients that had been saved and aged specifically for the occasion. Fruits, nuts, and spices that had been stored for months or even years were incorporated into these cakes, regardless of their condition. The aging process was supposed to concentrate flavours, but it often just concentrated bacteria and mould. Wedding meats were prepared using elaborate techniques that prioritised visual impact over food safety. Whole animals were roasted and then decorated with substances that weren't meant to be eaten but were consumed anyway. These decorative materials included toxic dyes, metal powders, and organic compounds that were dangerous to human health. Wedding ale was brewed months in advance and stored in conditions that encouraged fermentation and the growth of various microorganisms. By the time of the wedding, this ale often contained alcohol levels that were dangerous, as well as other compounds created by uncontrolled fermentation processes. The serving of wedding foods involved rituals that maximised the sharing of diseases and infections. Wedding guests were expected to drink from common cups, eat from shared platters, and participate in food-sharing ceremonies that ensured the rapid transmission of any illnesses present in the community. Medieval children's foods deserve additional attention because the substances fed to young people were often specifically designed to be as disgusting as possible, based on the belief that children needed to be toughened up for adult life. Children were fed foods that adults wouldn't consume, as part of their preparation for the harsh realities of medieval existence. School foods in medieval institutions were deliberately unappetizing, based on the theory that comfort and pleasure were detrimental to learning and character development. Students were fed porridges made from the cheapest and most contaminated grains available, mixed with water that was often visibly polluted. Children's medicine foods were designed to be as revolting as possible, based on the belief that effective medicine had to taste terrible to be beneficial. These medical foods contained combinations of bitter herbs, rancid oils, and other substances that were both disgusting and potentially dangerous. Punishment foods were given to children who misbehaved, and these were often the most revolting substances available in medieval households. Children might be forced to consume spoiled milk, rotten eggs, or other foods that were too dangerous for normal consumption, but were considered appropriate for disciplinary purposes. Coming-of-age foods were consumed during rituals that marked the transition from childhood to adulthood. These foods were often chosen specifically for their disgusting properties, as consuming them was supposed to demonstrate the young person's readiness for adult responsibilities and hardships. The preparation of children's foods involved methods that seemed designed to maximize their unappetizing qualities. Ingredients were deliberately chosen for their bitter, sour, or rotten flavors, and cooking methods were used that emphasized these unpleasant characteristics rather than trying to mask them. Medieval tavern foods represent yet another category of culinary horror, because these establishments served foods that were even more dangerous than home cooking. Taverns had no incentive to maintain food safety standards, and their customers were often too drunk to notice or care about the quality of what they were eating. Tavern stews were made in huge cauldrons that were never fully emptied or cleaned. New ingredients were added to whatever remained from previous batches, creating a continuously evolving mixture of decomposing organic matter. These stews had flavours that changed throughout the day, as new ingredients were added and old ones continued to decompose. Tavern bread was often made from sweepings from bakery floors, mixed with sawdust and other substances to increase volume. This bread had a gritty texture and bitter flavour from the various contaminants that had been incorporated into the dough. The baking process was often incomplete, leaving raw sections that harboured dangerous bacteria. Tavern ale was frequently watered down with whatever liquid was available, including water from contaminated sources. The watering process often introduced new bacteria and parasites into the ale, while reducing its alcohol content below levels that would naturally preserve it from spoilage. Tavern meat was often the cheapest and most questionable cuts available, prepared using methods that prioritised speed over safety. Meat was often served partially raw or overcooked to the point of being charred, with no middle ground between these two extremes. But we're still only halfway through our journey into medieval food horror. We haven't even touched on the travelling foods that people carried during long journeys, the prison foods that were designed to keep prisoners alive while being as unappetising as possible, or the military rations that soldiers consumed during campaigns. We haven't discussed the underground economy of forbidden foods, the seasonal variations that made certain times of year more dangerous than others, or the regional differences that made some areas of medieval Europe more culinarily hazardous than others. The rabbit hole of medieval food horror continues to deepen with every historical document we examine, every archaeological discovery we uncover, and every contemporary account we translate. Each new piece of evidence confirms that our medieval ancestors lived in a world where every meal was a gamble with death, and where survival often required consuming substances that would be considered weapons of mass destruction by modern standards. We haven't explored the world of medieval travel foods, and trust me, these portable meals make everything we've discussed so far look like fine dining. When medieval people embarked on long journeys, they couldn't exactly stop at roadside restaurants or pack modern trail mix. Instead, they carried foods that were designed to last for weeks or months without refrigeration, and the preservation methods they used created substances that were barely recognisable as food. The most common travel food was something called hardtack, but medieval hardtack wasn't the simple crackers you might imagine. This was bread that had been baked until it was rock hard, then left to age in damp storage areas, where it developed thick coatings of mould and became infested with weevils. By the time travellers actually ate this hardtack, it was more insect protein than grain, with a texture that required soaking in whatever liquid was available just to make it chewable. But here's what makes medieval hardtack truly revolting. The soaking liquid was usually stagnant water from whatever source travellers could find along their route. This water was often contaminated with animal waste, dead insects, and organic matter that had been decomposing for unknown periods of time. The hardtack absorbed all of these flavours and contaminants, creating a soggy, bitter paste that tasted like wet cardboard mixed with pond scum. Travellers also carried something called journey meat, which was flesh that had been dried using methods that would horrify modern food safety experts. The drying process involved hanging strips of meat in environments where they were exposed to insects, bird droppings, and whatever other contaminants happened to be in the air. The dried meat developed thick crusts of dirt and organic matter that weren't removed before eating. They were considered part of the preservation system. The preparation of journey meat involved no quality control over the source animals. sick, dying, or already dead animals were used just as readily as healthy ones, because the drying process was supposed to kill any dangerous bacteria. Of course it didn't, but medieval people had no way of knowing that the preservation method they relied on was actually concentrating toxins and creating new varieties of harmful microorganisms. Medieval travellers also carried travel cheese, which was cheese that had been aged specifically for portability rather than flavour or safety. This cheese was often so hard that it had to be gnawed like wood, and so salty that consuming it caused severe dehydration. The aging process took place in conditions that encouraged the growth of various moulds and bacteria, creating cheese that was more microorganism than dairy product. The containers used to carry travel foods were often made from animal organs that hadn't been properly cleaned or prepared. Bladders, stomachs, and intestines were used as portable containers, and they imparted their own flavours and contaminants to whatever foods were stored inside them. These organic containers also broke down over time, mixing their decomposing material with the food they were supposed to protect. Medieval military rations deserve their own special category of horror, because these were foods specifically designed to keep soldiers alive during campaigns while being as cheap and easy to produce as possible. Military cooks had no incentive to make food palatable or safe. They just needed to create substances that would provide enough nutrition to keep soldiers fighting. Army bread was made from the lowest quality grain available, mixed with whatever fillers could be found to increase volume. Sawdust, ground bark, and even sand were common additions to military bread, creating a product that was more like edible concrete than actual food. The baking process was often rushed, leaving raw sections that harboured dangerous bacteria while creating charred portions that were carcinogenic and nearly inedible. Military stew was prepared in massive cauldrons that served hundreds of soldiers at once. These cauldrons were never fully cleaned between batches, so each new stew was contaminated with remnants from previous meals. The ingredients included whatever meat could be procured, regardless of its condition, mixed with vegetables that were often spoiled or contaminated with battlefield debris. The cooking fuel used for military meals often included materials that weren't safe for food preparation. Soldiers burned whatever was available, including garbage, human waste, and the remains of dead animals and humans from battlefields. The smoke from these fires infused military food with compounds that were toxic and gave everything a distinctive flavour that veterans described as the taste of death. Military ale was brewed using water from whatever sources were available near military camps. These sources were often contaminated with sewage from the camps themselves, as well as runoff from battlefields, where human and animal remains were decomposing. The brewing process was rushed and used contaminated equipment, creating ale that was often more dangerous than the water it was supposed to replace. Let's talk about medieval prison food, because the substances fed to prisoners were designed to keep them alive while being as unappetizing and degrading as possible. Prison food was deliberately made disgusting as part of the punishment, based on the theory that criminals shouldn't enjoy any aspect of their incarceration. Prison bread was made from sweepings from bakery floors, mixed with whatever organic matter was available to increase volume. This bread often contained hair, dirt, insect parts, and other contaminants that had been swept up along with the grain. The texture was gritty and bitter, with flavours that prisoners described as like eating the floor of hell. Prison gruel was prepared using ingredients that were too spoiled or contaminated for any other use. Rotten vegetables, mouldy grain, and meat that was crawling with maggots were all considered appropriate for prison meals. The cooking process involved boiling these ingredients until they formed a paste that could be consumed without chewing, since many prisoners had lost their teeth due to malnutrition and poor hygiene. The serving of prison food involved deliberate contamination as part of the humiliation process. Food was served in containers that hadn't been cleaned, often containers that had been used for human waste or other unsanitary purposes. Guards would sometimes spit in the food or add other bodily fluids as additional punishment. Prison water was often drawn from sources that were intentionally contaminated. Wells near prisons were used as dumping grounds for waste from the prison itself, creating water that was visibly polluted and smelled of decay. Prisoners were given this water to drink, knowing full well that it would make them sick, because keeping prisoners healthy wasn't a priority. Medieval hospital food represents another category of institutionalized culinary horror, because even medical facilities served foods that were more likely to kill patients than cure them. Hospital kitchens operated under the same unsanitary conditions as everywhere else, but with the added challenge of feeding people who were already sick and vulnerable. Hospital gruel was made from ingredients that were considered too poor quality for healthy people to consume. Mouldy grain, spoiled milk, and rotten vegetables were all deemed appropriate for hospital patients, based on the theory that sick people couldn't afford to be choosy about their food. The preparation process involved no safety measures, ensuring that hospital food was contaminated with whatever diseases were already present in the facility. Hospital bread was often made from flour that had been stored in the same rooms where patients were dying from infectious diseases. This flour absorbed airborne pathogens and was then baked into bread that concentrated these disease agents. Patients consuming this bread were essentially eating concentrated versions of whatever illnesses were present in the hospital. Hospital wine was supposed to be medicinal, but it was often made from grapes that had been infected with various fungi and bacteria. The fermentation process took place in containers that hadn't been cleaned properly, adding additional microorganisms to wine that was supposed to help patients recover from illness. This wine often made patients sicker than they had been before consuming it. The serving of hospital food involved practices that ensured the rapid spread of diseases throughout the facility. The same utensils and containers were used for multiple patients without any cleaning in between. Patients with different diseases ate from the same bowls and drank from the same cups, creating perfect conditions for cross-contamination. Medieval orphanage food was designed to keep children alive at the lowest possible cost, with no consideration for nutrition, safety, or palatability. Orphans were fed foods that were considered too poor quality for families to give to their own children, creating a system where the most vulnerable members of society received the most dangerous food. Orphanage porridge was made from grain that had been rejected by commercial bakers as unfit for human consumption. This grain was often mouldy, infested with insects, and contaminated with various substances that made it bitter and potentially toxic. The cooking process involved adding water that was often contaminated with sewage from the orphanage itself. Orphan bread was made from flour that had been mixed with sawdust, ground bark, and other non-food substances to increase volume while reducing cost. This bread had a woody texture and bitter flavour that made it difficult to swallow, but orphans were forced to consume it because it was often their only source of calories. The milk given to orphans was often sour or contaminated with bacteria from improper storage. This milk was stored in containers that weren't cleaned properly and was often mixed with water to make it last longer. The watering process introduced additional contaminants while reducing the nutritional value of milk that was already questionable. Orphanage stew was made from scraps that couldn't be used for any other purpose. Vegetable peelings, meat bones with scraps of rotten flesh still attached, and other kitchen waste were boiled together to create a liquid that provided some calories while tasting like concentrated garbage. Let's discuss medieval funeral preparation foods, because the substances consumed during the preparation of bodies for burial were among the most revolting in the entire medieval diet. People involved in funeral preparation were expected to consume special foods that were supposed to protect them from the spiritual contamination of death, but these foods were often more dangerous than the corpses they were handling. Funeral workers consumed something called death bread, which was made from grain that had been stored in burial chambers, where it absorbed the vapours and moisture from decomposing bodies. This bread had a distinctive, sweet, cloying flavour that came from the organic compounds it had absorbed from the burial environment. The preparation process involved grinding this contaminated grain and mixing it with water that had been blessed in crypts and burial chambers. Gravediggers drank bone ale, which was brewed using water that had been drawn from wells located in cemeteries. This water was often contaminated with leachate from graves, containing dissolved organic matter from decomposing corpses. The brewing process concentrated these contaminants, creating ale that tasted like a mixture of alcohol and decay. Funeral preparers ate corpse cheese, which was cheese that had been aged in burial chambers, where it absorbed the moisture and vapours from decomposing bodies. This cheese developed flavours that were described as sweet and putrid at the same time, with textures that ranged from unnaturally soft to completely liquid. The consumption of these funeral foods was considered essential for spiritual protection, but it often resulted in illnesses that were worse than anything the funeral workers might have contracted from handling corpses. The foods were so contaminated with dangerous bacteria and toxic compounds that consuming them was essentially a form of slow poisoning. Medieval seasonal preservation created foods that were designed to last through specific seasons, but often became increasingly dangerous as time passed. Winter foods that had been preserved in autumn were often completely spoiled by spring, but they were consumed anyway because they were the only foods available. Winter vegetables were stored in underground pits that often flooded with contaminated water during spring thaws. These vegetables absorbed the flood water along with whatever contaminants it contained, including human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff from nearby towns. By the time these vegetables were consumed, they were more contamination than vegetable. Preserved winter meat was stored in conditions that encouraged controlled decomposition, based on the theory that partial rotting would prevent complete spoilage. This meat developed textures and flavours that were indescribable, with surfaces that were slimy and colours that ranged from green to black. The smell was so intense that it could be detected from considerable distances. Spring foods made from the first plants of the growing season were often toxic because these plants had grown in soil that was contaminated with the runoff from winter waste disposal. Medieval people had no understanding of soil contamination, so they consumed these early spring plants without realising that they were essentially eating concentrated versions of whatever toxins had accumulated in the soil over the winter. Medieval market foods represent another category of horror because the foods sold in public markets were often the most contaminated and dangerous substances available. Market vendors had no incentive to maintain food safety standards, and competition often led to the sale of foods that were increasingly adulterated and dangerous. Market bread was often made from flour that had been adulterated with cheaper substances to increase profit margins. Sand, sawdust and ground chalk were common additions that gave bread a gritty texture and bitter flavour while providing no nutritional value. Some bakers added substances that were actively harmful, including lead compounds that were used to whiten flour and make bread appear higher quality. Market meat was often from animals that had died from disease, rather than being slaughtered for food. These diseased animals were sold at lower prices to vendors who then tried to disguise their condition through various cooking and seasoning methods. The meat was often partially decomposed by the time it reached consumers, but the low prices made it attractive to people who couldn't afford better quality food. Market vegetables were often those that had been rejected by higher quality vendors because of obvious contamination or spoilage. These vegetables were sold at discount prices to people who were desperate enough to overlook their obvious problems. The contamination included everything from insect infestations to visible mold growth to chemical contamination from improper storage. Market dairy products were often made from milk that had been watered down with contaminated water to increase volume and profits. The watering process introduced new bacteria and parasites while reducing the nutritional value of products that were already questionable. Market cheese was often made from this watered-down milk and aged in conditions that encouraged the growth of dangerous microorganisms. Medieval guild foods were supposed to be higher quality because they were produced by organised craftsmen, but guild regulations often created new categories of horror rather than improving food safety. Guild bakers were required to use specific ingredients and methods that were based on tradition rather than safety, creating standardized products that were consistently dangerous. Guild ale was brewed according to recipes that had been passed down for generations without any understanding of food safety principles. These traditional recipes often included ingredients that were known to be potentially harmful, but they were required by guild regulations and couldn't be modified without losing guild membership. Guild meat was processed according to traditional methods that prioritized appearance and texture over safety. Guild butchers used techniques that had been developed centuries earlier, when the understanding of food safety was even more limited than it was during the height of the medieval period. Guild cheese was made using traditional aging methods that created products with specific flavors and textures that guild members were required to maintain. These aging methods often involved storing cheese in environments that encouraged the growth of specific types of mold and bacteria, some of which were dangerous to human health. Medieval religious dietary laws created additional categories of horror by requiring the consumption of foods that were inherently dangerous or by forbidding foods that might have been safer alternatives. Religious authorities made dietary rules based on theological principles rather than health considerations, creating situations where following religious law required consuming substances that were harmful. Fasting foods were consumed during religious periods when normal foods were forbidden. These fasting foods were often made from ingredients that were considered spiritually pure but were actually contaminated or dangerous. Fish that had been preserved using methods that encouraged bacterial growth was considered appropriate for religious fasting, even though consuming it often caused severe illness. Penance foods were consumed as acts of religious devotion, and these were specifically chosen for their unpalatable or dangerous qualities. The theory was that suffering through the consumption of revolting foods would bring spiritual benefits, so religious authorities encouraged people to consume foods that were as disgusting as possible. Religious feast foods were consumed during religious celebrations, and these were often more dangerous than everyday foods because they were prepared using elaborate methods that prioritized religious symbolism over food safety. These feast foods often included ingredients that had been blessed through exposure to religious relics, which often meant contamination with various organic substances. Medieval trade foods were ingredients and prepared foods that were imported from distant locations without any preservation or safety measures. These trade foods often arrived completely spoiled after months of travel, but they were consumed anyway because of their rarity and the investment that had been made in transporting them. Spice trade goods often arrived mouldy and contaminated with various substances that had been absorbed during transport. These spices were used anyway because they were so expensive, and the contamination was often considered part of their exotic character. The mold and bacteria that grew on these spices during transport created new compounds that were both bitter and potentially toxic. Preserved trade meats were prepared using preservation methods from the countries where they originated, but these methods often didn't work during the long transport times required to reach medieval European markets. By the time these preserved meats arrived at their destinations, they were often completely spoiled, but were still sold and consumed because of the investment in transporting them. Trade wines often arrived sour and contaminated after months of transport in containers that weren't designed for long-term storage. These wines were often mixed with local wines to disguise their spoiled condition, creating blended products that were more dangerous than either ingredient would have been on its own. Medieval ceremonial foods were consumed during important social and religious ceremonies, and these foods were often more dangerous than everyday foods because their preparation was guided by ceremonial requirements rather than safety considerations. The symbolic importance of these foods meant that they were consumed regardless of their condition or safety. Wedding ceremonial foods were prepared using ingredients that had been saved specifically for the occasion, often for months or years. These saved ingredients were often spoiled by the time they were used, but they were incorporated into wedding foods anyway because of their ceremonial significance. Coronation foods were prepared for royal ceremonies using elaborate methods that prioritized visual impact and symbolic meaning over food safety. These foods often included rare and exotic ingredients that had been transported long distances without proper preservation, creating dishes that were both expensive and dangerous. Religious ceremonial foods were consumed during important religious observances, and these foods were often chosen for their symbolic significance rather than their safety or palatability. Religious authorities encouraged the consumption of foods that represented spiritual concepts, even when these foods were inherently dangerous. Funeral ceremonial foods were consumed during burial rituals, and these foods were often made from ingredients that had been associated with death and burial. The preparation of these foods involved methods that emphasized their connection to death rather than their safety for consumption. Medieval seasonal ceremonial foods were consumed during seasonal celebrations, and these foods were often made from ingredients that were only available during specific times of year. The seasonal nature of these ingredients meant that they were often consumed regardless of their condition, because missing the seasonal window meant waiting an entire year for another opportunity. The patterns of medieval food horror reveal themselves when we examine how different social, economic, and religious factors combined to create systems where dangerous food consumption was not just accepted but actively encouraged. Every aspect of medieval society contributed to the creation and perpetuation of culinary practices that prioritized factors other than human health and safety. Economic factors created situations where people were forced to consume dangerous foods because safer alternatives were too expensive or unavailable. The medieval economy was based on scarcity and survival rather than abundance and choice, creating conditions where any available food was considered better than no food at all. Social factors created hierarchies where different classes of people were expected to consume different qualities of food, but even the highest quality foods available were dangerous by modern standards. Social pressure to maintain class distinctions meant that people often consumed foods that were inappropriate for their economic status, leading to situations where the poor ate foods that were too dangerous, while the rich ate foods that were too exotic and equally dangerous. Religious factors created dietary rules that often required the consumption of foods that were inherently dangerous, or the avoidance of foods that might have been safer alternatives. Religious authorities made dietary decisions based on theological principles rather than health considerations, creating situations where following religious law required consuming dangerous substances. Cultural factors created traditions and customs that perpetuated dangerous food practices across generations. Traditional recipes and preparation methods were passed down without any understanding of their health implications, creating cultural continuity that ensured the persistence of dangerous culinary practices. Geographic factors created regional variations in food danger, with some areas of medieval Europe being more culinarily hazardous than others. Climate, soil conditions, and water sources all contributed to regional differences in food contamination and safety. Technological factors limited the preservation and preparation methods available to medieval people, ensuring that even their best efforts to create safe food often resulted in products that were contaminated and dangerous. The lack of scientific understanding about food safety meant that technological improvements often made food more dangerous rather than safer. But the true scope of medieval food horror becomes clear when we realise that everything we've discussed represents just the documented practices. The foods that were considered normal enough to write about in cookbooks and historical records, the undocumented practices, the desperate survival foods, and the truly experimental culinary disasters of medieval Europe remain largely unknown to us. Archaeological evidence continues to reveal new categories of medieval food horror as researchers develop better methods for analysing food residues and human remains from medieval sites. Each new discovery confirms that the reality of medieval cuisine was even worse than the historical records suggest. The psychological impact of consuming these foods on medieval people themselves is something we can only imagine. Living in a world where every meal was a potential source of illness or death must have created levels of anxiety and stress that we can barely comprehend in our modern world of food safety regulations and reliable nutrition. The social dynamics created by these dangerous food practices influenced every aspect of medieval life, from family relationships to economic systems to political structures. When basic nutrition was this dangerous and unreliable, it affected everything else in medieval society. And yet somehow, despite consuming foods that would be considered weapons of mass destruction by modern standards, medieval people managed to survive long enough to reproduce and create the civilizations that eventually evolved into our modern world. The human capacity for survival in the face of extreme adversity is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of this entire culinary nightmare. But we're still not done exploring the depths of medieval food horror. We haven't even touched on the truly exotic delicacies that medieval people sought out specifically because they were rare and revolting, or the underground markets where desperate people traded in substances that defied classification as food. The journey into medieval culinary horror continues to reveal new layers of disgust and danger with every historical document we examine and every archaeological site we excavate. The reality of what our ancestors consumed makes everything we've discussed so far seem like just the beginning of a much larger and more horrifying story. The seasonal markets that operated during specific times of year created temporary opportunities for foods that were so dangerous they could only be sold when desperation reached its peak. Winter markets, held when stored foods were running low and fresh options were non-existent, became gathering places for merchants selling substances that barely qualified as edible. Ice wine was one such seasonal horror, wine that had been left outside during winter freezes, where it absorbed whatever contaminants were present in the freezing air. The freezing process concentrated both the alcohol and any toxins that had been dissolved in the wine, creating a product that was simultaneously intoxicating and poisonous. The preparation involved leaving wine barrels exposed to winter weather for weeks, during which time they collected snow, ice, bird droppings, and whatever other substances happened to fall from the sky. Winter root cellars created their own category of seasonal nightmare foods. These underground storage spaces were designed to keep vegetables fresh through the cold months, but they often became breeding grounds for bacteria and fungi that thrived in the damp, dark conditions. By midwinter, these cellars contained vegetables that had been transformed into something completely different from what had originally been stored there. Root vegetables stored in these cellars developed thick, slimy coatings that weren't removed before consumption. Turnips became soft and black, with textures that resembled rotting wood more than food. Carrots developed fuzzy growths that covered their entire surface, while potatoes sprouted toxic green shoots that were often eaten along with the rest of the vegetable. The air in these root cellars became thick with spores and bacteria that infected everything stored inside. Vegetables that had been healthy when stored became contaminated through contact with the cellar environment, creating a system where even good food became dangerous simply through proximity to spoiled items. Spring cleaning of these cellars revealed the true extent of the horror that had been developing throughout the winter months. Piles of liquefied vegetables, colonies of fungi that had grown to enormous sizes, and infestations of insects and other creatures that had been feeding on the decomposing organic matter created scenes that would challenge even the strongest stomachs. Medieval beekeeping produced honey that was supposed to be a pure and natural sweetener, but the reality of medieval honey production created products that were often more dangerous than refined sugar would have been if it had been available. Medieval beekeepers had no understanding of bee health or honey purity, leading to honey that was contaminated with everything from dead bees to bacterial infections. Diseased hives produced honey that contained the pathogens that had killed the bees, creating sweet substances that were vectors for various illnesses. Beekeepers often harvested honey from hives that had been infected with fungal diseases, bacterial infections, or parasitic infestations, and these pathogens remained active in the honey even after it had been processed. The processing of medieval honey involved methods that introduced additional contamination rather than removing existing problems. Honey was often filtered through cloth that hadn't been cleaned properly, using containers that had been used for other purposes without adequate cleaning between uses. Wild honey, collected from natural hives found in forests and fields, was even more dangerous than domesticated honey because it came from bees that had been feeding on whatever plants were available in their environment. These plants often included toxic species that weren't safe for human consumption, and the toxins from these plants concentrated in the honey produced by bees that fed on them. The storage of honey in medieval households created additional opportunities for contamination. Honey was stored in containers made from organic materials that broke down over time, mixing their decomposing substances with the honey they were supposed to protect. Clay pots often contained lead glazes that leached into stored honey, while wooden containers absorbed and released various substances that altered both the flavour and safety of the honey. Medieval fermentation practices created alcoholic beverages that were more dangerous than the water they were supposed to replace. The fermentation process was supposed to kill harmful bacteria, but medieval fermentation methods often created new varieties of dangerous microorganisms while failing to eliminate existing ones. Mead made from fermented honey and water was particularly dangerous because both ingredients were often contaminated before the fermentation process even began. Contaminated honey was mixed with polluted water and allowed to ferment in containers that hadn't been properly cleaned, creating an alcoholic beverage that concentrated toxins from multiple sources. The fermentation process for mead often took place in containers that had been used for other purposes, including storage of human waste and other unsanitary materials. These containers imparted their own flavours and contaminants to the fermenting mead, creating beverages that were both alcoholic and toxic. Medieval wine production faced similar problems, with grapes that were often diseased or contaminated being processed using methods that prioritized quantity over quality. Grapes that had been infected with various fungi were still used for wine production, and the fermentation process concentrated these fungal toxins while creating new toxic compounds through the interaction of alcohol with contaminated organic matter. The storage of medieval wine in containers that weren't designed for long-term preservation created wines that became increasingly dangerous as they aged. Lead-lined containers leached toxic metals into stored wine, while wooden barrels that hadn't been properly prepared allowed various contaminants to seep into the wine over time. Medieval distillation, when it was practiced, created spirits that were often more dangerous than the original fermented beverages. The distillation process concentrated both alcohol and any toxins that had been present in the original mixture, creating products that were simultaneously more intoxicating and more poisonous than their starting materials. The equipment used for medieval distillation often contained materials that weren't safe for contact with food or beverages. Lead pipes and containers were commonly used because they were easy to work with, but they leached toxic metals into everything that passed through them. Let's examine medieval cooking competitions and festivals, because these events created pressures to produce foods that were more elaborate and dangerous than everyday meals. Cooking competitions encouraged participants to create dishes that prioritized visual impact and novelty over safety, leading to culinary creations that were essentially edible art projects with potentially lethal ingredients. Festival foods were often made using ingredients that had been saved specifically for the occasion, regardless of their condition when the festival arrived. Spices that had been stored for months or years were used in festival dishes even when they had become mouldy and contaminated, because their rarity and expense made them too valuable to discard. Competition dishes often included exotic ingredients that had been transported from distant locations without proper preservation methods. These ingredients were incorporated into dishes that were designed to impress judges and spectators rather than provide safe nutrition, creating foods that were essentially poisonous art installations. The judging of these cooking competitions involved tasting foods that were known to be potentially dangerous, but the social pressure to participate in these events meant that judges consumed whatever was presented to them regardless of obvious safety concerns. Medieval street food vendors created another category of culinary horror by selling foods that were prepared under the worst possible conditions and consumed by people who had no other options. Street vendors had no permanent kitchens, no reliable sources of clean water, and no incentive to maintain food safety standards. Street vendor bread was often made from flour that had been purchased from the cheapest sources available, regardless of its quality or contamination. This flour was mixed with water from whatever sources were accessible to the vendor, often contaminated street runoff or water from public wells that were known to be polluted. The cooking equipment used by street vendors was often improvised from materials that weren't designed for food preparation. Cooking pots were made from materials that leached toxic substances into food, while cooking fires were fueled with whatever combustible materials could be found on the streets. Street vendor meat was often from animals that had died from unknown causes rather than being slaughtered specifically for food. These animals were butchered under unsanitary conditions and cooked using methods that prioritized speed over safety, creating meat products that were dangerous even by medieval standards. The serving of street vendor food involved no sanitary precautions whatsoever. Food was served on whatever containers were available, often containers that had been used for other purposes without any cleaning in between. Customers ate with their hands or with utensils that had been shared among multiple people without washing. Medieval apprentice foods represent another category of horror because young people learning trades were often fed foods that were considered too poor quality for experienced workers. Apprentices were at the bottom of the social hierarchy and received the worst food available, creating a system where the most vulnerable members of society consumed the most dangerous substances. Apprentice bread was made from the sweepings of master bakers' floors, mixed with whatever fillers were available to increase volume. This bread contained dirt, hair, insect parts, and other contaminants that had accumulated on bakery floors over time. Apprentice stew was made from scraps that couldn't be used for any other purpose, including meat that was too spoiled for regular consumption and vegetables that had been rejected by other customers. The cooking process involved boiling these scraps until they formed a paste that could be consumed without chewing. The serving conditions for apprentice food ensured maximum contamination and minimum nutrition. Apprentices ate from containers that weren't cleaned between meals, using utensils that were shared among multiple people without any sanitary precautions. Medieval plague foods deserve special attention because, during outbreaks of disease, people consumed substances that they believed would protect them from infection. But these foods were often more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to prevent. Plague protection foods were based on medical theories that had no scientific foundation and often involved consuming toxic substances. Theriac, the supposed cure-all medicine we mentioned earlier, was consumed in larger quantities during plague outbreaks, leading to mass poisoning events that were often worse than the plague itself. The ingredients in theriac included substances that were known to be poisonous, but they were consumed anyway because people were desperate for any protection against disease. Plague bread was made from flour that had been blessed by religious authorities and mixed with herbs that were supposed to provide spiritual protection against disease. These herbs were often toxic plants that had been misidentified or contaminated with dangerous substances during storage. Plague ale was brewed using recipes that were supposed to provide medical benefits, but these recipes often included ingredients that were harmful to human health. The brewing process was modified to include herbs and other substances that were believed to have protective properties, creating beverages that were both alcoholic and toxic. The consumption of plague foods was often mandated by local authorities who believed that these substances would prevent the spread of disease. People were required to consume these dangerous foods, regardless of their obvious health risks, creating situations where government policy actively promoted poisoning. Medieval famine foods represent the absolute bottom of the culinary horror scale, because these were substances that people consumed when all other options had been exhausted. Famine foods weren't chosen for their nutritional value or safety. They were consumed simply because they were the only substances available that could potentially provide calories. Tree bark bread was made from the inner bark of trees, ground into flour, and mixed with whatever other substances could be found. This bark flour had no nutritional value and often contained toxic compounds that had been absorbed by the tree from contaminated soil. Leather soup was made by boiling leather goods until they broke down into a gelatinous paste that could be consumed. The leather used for this soup had often been treated with toxic chemicals during the tanning process, and these chemicals concentrated in the soup during the cooking process. Grass porridge was made from whatever grasses could be found, regardless of their safety, for human consumption. Many of these grasses contained toxic compounds that caused digestive problems, while others were contaminated with animal waste and other substances that made them dangerous to consume. Clay bread was made by mixing edible clay with whatever organic matter could be found, creating a substance that provided bulk but no nutrition. The clay used for this bread was often contaminated with heavy metals and other toxic substances that accumulated in people's bodies over time. The preparation of famine foods involved no safety considerations whatsoever, because safety was a luxury that starving people couldn't afford. Any substance that could potentially provide calories was considered food, regardless of its obvious dangers. Medieval mining town foods created their own special category of horror because mining operations contaminated local water and soil sources, making all locally produced food dangerous to consume. Mining towns were often located in areas where the extraction process had poisoned the environment, creating communities where every meal was contaminated with toxic metals and chemicals. Mining town water was contaminated with runoff from mining operations, including heavy metals, toxic chemicals, and other substances that had been used in the extraction process. This contaminated water was used for all cooking and food preparation, ensuring that every meal contained concentrated toxins. Mining town vegetables were grown in soil that had been contaminated with mining waste, creating plants that absorbed toxic metals through their roots. These vegetables often had unusual colours and flavours that came from the toxic substances they had absorbed, but they were consumed anyway because they were the only fresh food available. Mining town livestock were fed on grasses and grains that had been contaminated with mining waste, creating meat and dairy products that contained concentrated toxins. These animals often showed signs of poisoning themselves, but their meat was still consumed because it was the only protein source available. The cooking fuel used in mining towns often included waste materials from mining operations, creating smoke that was toxic and contaminated food during the cooking process. This smoke contained heavy metals and other toxic substances that were absorbed by food during cooking. Medieval dye works and tannery foods represent another category of industrial contamination, because these operations used chemicals that poisoned local food sources. Communities located near these industrial operations consumed foods that had been contaminated with toxic dyes, heavy metals, and other industrial chemicals. Tannery runoff contaminated local water sources with chromium, mercury, and other toxic metals that were used in the leather-making process. This contaminated water was used for cooking and food preparation, ensuring that every meal contained these toxic substances. Dye works contaminated local soil and water with toxic dyes and mordants that were absorbed by locally grown food. Vegetables grown near dye works often had unusual colours that came from the toxic dyes they had absorbed, creating foods that were essentially edible poison. The air around these industrial operations was contaminated with toxic vapours that were absorbed by food during storage and preparation. Bread baked near these operations absorbed toxic compounds from the air, creating foods that were contaminated even before they were consumed. Medieval salt production created foods that were contaminated with whatever substances had been present in the salt-making process. Salt was often produced in areas where the brine sources were contaminated with industrial waste, sewage, and other toxic substances that concentrated in the finished salt. Contaminated salt was used for food preservation, creating preserved foods that were more dangerous than fresh foods would have been. The preservation process concentrated both the salt and any toxins that had been present in the salt, creating preserved foods that were essentially pickled poison. The production of salt often involved boiling brine in containers that had been used for other purposes, including containers that had been contaminated with toxic substances. These containers leached their contaminants into the salt during the production process. Medieval glass-making operations created another source of industrial contamination, because glass production used lead and other toxic metals that contaminated local food sources. Communities located near glassworks consumed foods that had been contaminated with lead, arsenic, and other toxic substances used in glass production. Lead contamination from glassworks was particularly dangerous because lead accumulated in the human body over time, creating chronic poisoning that affected multiple generations of people living in these communities. The fuel used for glass making often included materials that created toxic smoke, and this smoke contaminated food that was stored or prepared in the area around glassworks. The contamination was often invisible and odourless, making it impossible for people to know that their food had been poisoned. Medieval metalworking operations created similar contamination problems because metalworking used mercury, lead, and other toxic substances that poisoned local food sources. Blacksmiths, armourers, and other metal workers created toxic environments that contaminated everything around them. Mercury contamination from metalworking operations was particularly dangerous because mercury vapour was absorbed by food during storage and preparation. Bread stored near metalworking operations absorbed mercury vapour, creating foods that caused mercury poisoning in people who consumed them. The coal and charcoal used for metalworking created smoke that contained toxic compounds, and this smoke contaminated food that was exposed to it during cooking or storage. The contamination was cumulative, building up over time in people who lived near these operations. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all these industrial contamination problems was that medieval people had no understanding of the connection between industrial operations and food contamination. They consumed contaminated foods without realizing that their illnesses were caused by toxic substances in their diet. The patterns of illness in medieval communities often followed the patterns of industrial contamination, but without scientific understanding of cause and effect. People attributed their illnesses to supernatural causes rather than environmental toxins. Medieval communities that were located away from industrial operations still faced contamination problems from travelling merchants who transported contaminated goods from industrial areas to clean areas. Contaminated salt, metals, and other goods spread industrial toxins throughout medieval Europe. The interconnected nature of medieval trade meant that contamination from industrial operations in one area could affect food safety in communities that were hundreds of miles away. A contaminated batch of salt produced near mining operations could poison communities throughout an entire region, and we're still only scratching the surface of medieval food horror. We haven't even begun to explore the truly experimental foods that medieval alchemists created in their attempts to transmute base materials into gold, or the foods that were consumed during religious ecstasies and mystical experiences. We haven't discussed the foods that were consumed during medieval surgical procedures, when patients were given substances that were supposed to dull pain, but often caused additional complications. We haven't explored the foods that were fed to people who were considered mentally ill, based on medical theories that connected diet to mental health in ways that were completely wrong. The scope of medieval culinary horror continues to expand as we examine every aspect of medieval life and discover new ways that food became a vector for disease, poisoning, and death. Every social institution, every economic system, and every technological innovation of the medieval period created new opportunities for food to become dangerous. The cumulative effect of all these different sources of food contamination created a medieval world where survival itself was a daily miracle. The human body's ability to adapt to and survive these constant assaults from contaminated food is perhaps the most remarkable aspect of medieval life. But the story of medieval food horror is far from over. There are still entire categories of disgusting and dangerous foods that we haven't explored, and the archaeological record continues to reveal new evidence of just how horrifying medieval cuisine really was. The journey into the depths of medieval culinary nightmare continues to reveal new layers of horror with every historical document we examine and every archaeological site we excavate. The reality of what our ancestors consumed makes everything we've discussed so far seem like just the tip of an iceberg of gastronomic terror that extends far deeper than we could have imagined. The agricultural practices of medieval Europe created contamination that went far beyond anything we've discussed. Medieval farmers had no understanding of crop rotation, soil health, or the dangers of using human waste as fertilizer. Fields were fertilised with fresh human excrement that was crawling with parasites and bacteria, creating crops that were essentially pre-infected before they even reached the table. But here's what makes this even more revolting. The fertilisation process was often done by prisoners and social outcasts who were forced to spread human waste by hand. These workers had open wounds, skin diseases, and various infections that they transferred directly to the crops they were fertilising. The vegetables that grew in these fields absorbed not just the nutrients from human waste, but also the diseases and parasites that came with it. Medieval grain storage created another category of horror that affected the daily bread of millions of people. Grain was stored in massive communal silos that were never cleaned and were infested with rats, mice, and insects. These storage facilities became breeding grounds for every pest imaginable, and the grain that came out of them was more vermin than food. The grinding process for this contaminated grain involved millstones that were never properly cleaned, and often contained lead and other toxic metals. As grain was ground, it picked up metal shavings, stone dust, and whatever organic matter had accumulated on the grinding surfaces. Medieval flour was essentially a mixture of grain, metal particles, stone dust, and decomposing organic matter. But the true horror of medieval grain storage becomes apparent when we examine the records of what else was found in these storage facilities. Human remains, animal carcasses, and other organic matter that had fallen into the grain stores were often ground up along with the grain. Medieval bread literally contained the ground-up remains of whatever had died in the grain storage areas. Medieval fish farming created aquaculture that was more like sewage treatment than food production. Fish ponds were often located downstream from towns and were used as dumping grounds for human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial runoff. The fish that grew in these ponds fed on human excrement and decomposing organic matter, creating protein sources that were essentially swimming sewage. The harvesting of these farm-raised fish involved no quality control whatsoever. Dead fish, diseased fish, and healthy fish were all harvested together and sold as food. The processing involved no cleaning or safety measures, so consumers received fish that were filled with parasites, bacterial infections, and toxic substances they had absorbed from their contaminated environment. Wild fish caught in medieval rivers and streams were often even more dangerous than farm-raised fish because medieval waterways were open sewers that carried waste from multiple towns and industrial operations. Fish caught in these waters had absorbed toxins from dozens of different sources and were often visibly diseased when they were caught. The preservation of these contaminated fish involved methods that concentrated rather than eliminated the dangers. Fish were salted using contaminated salt, smoked using toxic fuels, and dried in environments that added new layers of contamination. By the time preserved fish reached consumers, they contained concentrated versions of every toxin and pathogen they had originally absorbed. Medieval poultry farming created birds that were walking disease factories. Chickens, ducks, and geese were kept in conditions that would horrify modern animal welfare advocates, crammed into tiny spaces where they lived in their own excrement and fed on garbage and carrion. These birds were constantly sick and infected with parasites that they passed on to anyone who consumed their meat or eggs. The slaughtering of these diseased birds involved no health inspections or safety measures. Sick birds were slaughtered alongside healthy ones, and the processing involved no steps to prevent cross-contamination. The meat from diseased birds was often visibly infected with abscesses and other signs of illness, but it was sold as food anyway. Medieval egg production involved collecting eggs from birds that were severely malnourished and diseased. These eggs often contained partially developed embryos that had died from the diseases affecting their mothers. The eggs were frequently cracked and contaminated with fecal matter, but they were consumed anyway because protein was too valuable to waste. The storage of eggs involved no refrigeration and no understanding of how to prevent spoilage. Eggs were stored in conditions that encouraged bacterial growth, and they were often consumed weeks or months after they had spoiled. The smell and appearance of rotten eggs was considered normal, and techniques were developed to mask their putrid taste rather than to prevent spoilage. Medieval dairy farming created milk products that were vehicles for every disease imaginable. Cows, goats, and sheep were kept in filthy conditions, where they were constantly exposed to diseases that affected the quality and safety of their milk. These animals were often sick with infections that were transmitted through their milk to anyone who consumed it. The milking process involved no sanitary precautions whatsoever. Milk was collected in dirty containers by people who had no understanding of hygiene, often people who were themselves sick with various diseases. The milk was contaminated from the moment it left the animal until it reached the consumer. Medieval butter production involved churning milk that was already contaminated, using equipment that was never properly cleaned. The churning process was often done by hand in wooden containers that absorbed bacteria and odours from previous batches. The butter that resulted from this process was often rancid before it was even finished, with flavours that ranged from sour to putrid. The aging of medieval cheese involved storing it in environments that were designed to encourage the growth of mould and bacteria. Cheese caves were often located in areas that were also used for waste disposal, creating aging environments that exposed cheese to every pathogen imaginable. The cheese that emerged from these caves was often more microorganism than dairy product. Medieval herb and spice gardens created seasonings that were more dangerous than the foods they were supposed to flavour. Medicinal and culinary herbs were grown in the same plots, often without any understanding of which plants were safe for consumption and which were poisonous. Gardens often contained deadly nightshade, hemlock, and other toxic plants growing alongside culinary herbs. The harvesting of herbs and spices involved no identification or safety measures. Poisonous plants were often harvested, along with edible ones, creating spice mixtures that could kill anyone who consumed them. The drying and storage of these mixed herbs concentrated their toxins while making it impossible to identify which plants were dangerous. Medieval herb storage involved hanging dried plants in areas where they were exposed to contamination from smoke, dust, and organic matter. Herbs absorbed whatever substances were present in their storage environment, creating seasonings that were flavoured with toxic compounds from their surroundings. The grinding of dried herbs and spices was done using equipment that was contaminated with previous batches, creating spice mixtures that contained traces of every substance that had been processed in the same equipment. Poisonous plants that had been ground earlier left residues that contaminated subsequent batches of culinary herbs. Medieval beekeeping practices created honey that was often more dangerous than the sugar alternatives that weren't yet available. Beehives were often located in areas that were contaminated with industrial waste or human sewage, creating bees that fed on toxic substances and produced honey that contained concentrated toxins. The harvesting of honey involved smoking bees with whatever combustible materials were available, often including toxic substances that contaminated the honey during the harvesting process. The smoke used to calm bees often contained compounds from burning garbage, human waste, and industrial materials. Medieval honey processing involved filtering honey through materials that added their own contamination to the finished product. Cloth filters were often contaminated with bacteria and other substances that were transferred to the honey during the filtering process. The storage of honey in medieval households involved containers that weren't designed for food storage and often leached toxic substances into the honey over time. Lead-glazed pottery was commonly used for honey storage, creating honey that was contaminated with lead and other heavy metals. Medieval wild food gathering created another category of horror as people foraged for plants, mushrooms, and other foods without any understanding of what was safe to consume. Foragers often collected poisonous plants that resembled edible ones, creating gathered foods that were essentially random mixtures of nutrition and poison. The identification of wild mushrooms was based on folklore and superstition rather than scientific knowledge, leading to the consumption of deadly varieties that caused organ failure and death. Mushroom poisoning was common in medieval communities, but people continued to gather wild mushrooms because they were often the only food available. Wild berries and fruits were gathered from plants that grew in contaminated soil or near sources of pollution. These fruits absorbed toxins through their roots and concentrated them in their flesh, creating sweet treats that were actually concentrated poison. The preparation of wild foods involved no safety testing or identification verification. Gathered plants were cooked and consumed immediately, often without any attempt to determine whether they were safe for human consumption. Medieval food storage created environments that were designed to maximize contamination and spoilage. Root cellars, grain stores, and other food storage areas were poorly ventilated, damp, and infested with vermin that contaminated everything they touched. The construction of food storage areas involved no understanding of how to prevent contamination or control temperature and humidity. Storage areas were often located in places that flooded regularly, exposing stored food to contaminated water that introduced new pathogens and toxins. Medieval food containers were made from materials that weren't safe for food storage and often contributed their own contamination to stored food. Lead-lined containers leached toxic metals into food, while organic containers decomposed and mixed their rotting material with the food they were supposed to protect. The organisation of food storage involved no separation between different types of food or between fresh and spoiled items. Healthy food was stored alongside contaminated food, ensuring that contamination spread throughout entire storage areas. Medieval food transportation created additional opportunities for contamination as food was moved from production areas to markets and consumers. Transportation involved no refrigeration, no protection from contamination, and no quality control during the journey. Food was transported in containers that had been used for other purposes, often including containers that had held human waste, industrial chemicals, and other toxic substances. These containers contaminated food during transport, ensuring that even food that had been safe at the point of production became dangerous by the time it reached consumers. The people who transported food often had diseases and infections that they transmitted to the food they handled. Transportation workers had no understanding of hygiene and often contaminated food through direct contact during loading, unloading, and handling. Medieval food markets created environments where contamination was inevitable and quality control was non-existent. Markets were located in areas that were already contaminated with waste and industrial runoff, ensuring that even the act of selling food introduced new sources of contamination. Market vendors had no incentive to maintain food safety and often sold food that they knew was contaminated or spoiled. Competition between vendors led to the sale of increasingly dangerous foods, as merchants tried to undercut each other's prices by selling lower quality products. The display of food in medieval markets involved no protection from contamination by dust, insects, animal waste, and human contact. Food was exposed to whatever substances were present in the market environment, absorbing contamination throughout the day. Medieval food preparation tools and techniques created additional opportunities for contamination at every stage of the cooking process. Knives, cutting boards, and other tools were never properly cleaned and often contained residues from previous uses that contaminated new foods. The sharpening of knives and other cutting tools involved grinding them against stones that were contaminated with metal particles, organic matter, and other substances that were transferred to food during cutting. Medieval cutting tools were essentially contamination delivery devices that spread dangerous substances to everything they touched. Cooking fires were fueled with whatever combustible materials were available, creating smoke that was often toxic and contaminated food during the cooking process. The ashes from these fires fell directly into cooking pots, adding gritty textures and potentially toxic substances to cooked food. Medieval cooking vessels were made from materials that weren't safe for food contact and often leached toxic substances into food during cooking. Lead-lined pots were common and contaminated everything cooked in them with toxic metals. The cleaning of cooking vessels involved no understanding of sanitation and often involved washing them in contaminated water that added new sources of contamination rather than removing existing ones. Soap was rarely available, and when it was used, it was often made from toxic substances that left dangerous residues on clean surfaces. Medieval dining practices ensured that diseases and contamination spread rapidly through communities during every meal. People shared eating utensils, drinking vessels, and serving dishes without any cleaning between users, creating perfect conditions for the transmission of infectious diseases. The serving of food involved no sanitary precautions and often involved contamination by the people serving the food. Servants and food handlers had diseases and infections that they transmitted to food through direct contact during serving. Medieval table manners actually encouraged practices that maximised the spread of contamination. Diners were expected to share food directly from common dishes, to drink from shared cups, and to tear bread with their hands, ensuring that saliva, blood, and other bodily fluids were exchanged during every meal. The disposal of food waste created additional contamination problems, as leftover food was often saved and reused in ways that made it even more dangerous than it had been originally. Food scraps were fed to animals that were later consumed, creating a cycle of contamination that affected multiple generations of food. Medieval food preservation techniques were based on trial and error rather than scientific understanding, leading to preservation methods that often made food more dangerous rather than safer. Salt preservation used contaminated salt that added new toxins to preserved food, while smoking used toxic fuels that contaminated food with carcinogenic compounds. The fermentation of foods and beverages was done without any understanding of the microorganisms involved in the process, leading to fermented products that contained dangerous bacteria and toxins alongside the intended alcohol or acids. Medieval food regulations were based on economic and social considerations rather than health and safety, creating legal frameworks that actually encouraged the sale and consumption of dangerous foods. Guild regulations often required the use of traditional methods that were known to be dangerous, while market regulations focused on fair pricing rather than food safety. The enforcement of food regulations involved no testing or quality control and relied entirely on visual inspection by people who had no understanding of food safety. Regulatory officials often accepted bribes to overlook obvious safety violations, creating systems where the most dangerous foods were often officially approved for sale. Medieval medical theories about food created additional dangers, as physicians prescribed foods that were actually harmful based on incorrect understanding of nutrition and health. Medical diets often included toxic substances that were believed to have healing properties, creating situations where following medical advice could be more dangerous than the original illness. The preparation of medicinal foods involved no safety testing and often included ingredients that were known to be poisonous but were believed to be beneficial in small doses. These medicinal foods often contained combinations of toxic substances that were more dangerous together than they would have been individually. Medieval religious dietary laws created additional complications by requiring the consumption of foods that were inherently dangerous, or by forbidding foods that might have been safer alternatives. Religious authorities made dietary rules based on theological principles rather than health considerations, creating situations where following religious law required consuming dangerous substances. The preparation of religious foods often involved ritual contamination, as foods were blessed through contact with religious objects that were themselves contaminated with organic matter from previous blessings. Religious foods were often more dangerous than secular foods because of the additional contamination introduced through religious rituals. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of medieval food horror was the complete normalization of these dangerous conditions. Medieval people accepted contaminated, spoiled, and toxic food as normal parts of life, developing cultural practices and social institutions that perpetuated and encouraged the consumption of substances that were essentially poison. The social pressure to consume dangerous foods as demonstrations of loyalty, religious devotion, or social status created situations where refusing to eat contaminated food was considered socially unacceptable. People poisoned themselves and their families to maintain their social standing and religious obligations. Medieval children grew up in environments where consuming dangerous food was considered normal and necessary, creating generations of people who had no understanding of what safe food looked like or tasted like. The normalization of food danger created cultural continuity that ensured these practices continued for centuries. The economic systems of medieval Europe were built around the production and distribution of dangerous food, creating financial incentives that encouraged the continued production of contaminated and toxic food products. Safer alternatives were often too expensive or unavailable, making dangerous food the only economically viable option for most people. The technological limitations of medieval Europe meant that even the best efforts to create safe food often resulted in products that were contaminated and dangerous. The lack of scientific understanding about food safety meant that technological improvements often made food more dangerous rather than safer, and yet despite consuming foods that would be considered biological weapons by modern standards, medieval people somehow managed to survive long enough to reproduce and create the civilizations that eventually evolved into our modern world. The human capacity for survival in the face of extreme culinary adversity remains one of the most remarkable aspects of medieval life. The scope of medieval food horror continues to expand as researchers develop new methods for analysing historical evidence and archaeological remains. Each new discovery confirms that the reality of medieval cuisine was even worse than the historical records suggest, revealing new categories of contamination and danger that we're only beginning to understand. The psychological and social impacts of living in a world where every meal was potentially lethal created stress and anxiety that affected every aspect of medieval life. The constant threat of food poisoning, nutritional deficiency, and toxic exposure shaped medieval culture in ways that we're still trying to understand. The interconnected nature of medieval society meant that contamination and danger in one area quickly spread to affect entire regions and populations. A single contaminated batch of grain or a polluted water source could poison communities hundreds of miles away through the medieval trade networks that connected all of Europe. But the true horror of medieval food becomes clear when we realise that everything we've discussed represents just the documented practices, the foods that were considered normal enough to write about in historical records. The undocumented experiments, the desperate survival foods, and the truly horrific culinary disasters of medieval Europe remain largely unknown to us, hidden in the shadows of history. The archaeological evidence continues to reveal new depths of medieval food horror as researchers excavate medieval kitchens, storage areas, and waste disposal sites. Each new excavation uncovers evidence of food practices that were even more dangerous and disgusting than anything we've previously discovered. The analysis of human remains from medieval cemeteries reveals the cumulative effects of consuming contaminated food over entire lifetimes. The bone chemistry, tooth decay patterns, and evidence of nutritional deficiencies paint a picture of populations that were slowly poisoning themselves with every meal they consumed. But we're still far from reaching the bottom of this culinary nightmare. There are entire categories of medieval food horror that remain to be explored. Underground markets where desperate people traded substances that barely qualified as food, and experimental foods that were created by medieval alchemists and physicians in their attempts to transmute base materials into nutrition. The journey into medieval food horror reveals not just the disgusting reality of what our ancestors consumed, but also the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of conditions that seem almost impossible to survive. The fact that medieval civilization not only survived but eventually flourished despite these horrific dietary conditions speaks to the remarkable adaptability of human beings when faced with extreme adversity. And yet, as we continue to dig deeper into the historical record and archaeological evidence, we discover that we've only begun to scratch the surface of just how truly horrifying medieval food really was. The depths of this culinary nightmare continue to reveal themselves with each new document we translate and each new archaeological site we excavate. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human survival against impossible odds, of civilizations that somehow managed to grow and develop despite consuming substances that would be considered weapons of mass destruction by modern standards. It's a testament to the incredible resilience of our species and a reminder of just how far we've come in our understanding of food safety and nutrition. But it's also a cautionary tale about what happens when societies lose their understanding of basic food safety principles, and a stark reminder of the importance of the food safety systems that we often take for granted in our modern world. The interconnected web of medieval food contamination reached its most terrifying depths when we examine how these various sources of poison combined and concentrated throughout the food system. Medieval people weren't just consuming individual contaminated foods, they were consuming foods that had been contaminated by multiple sources simultaneously, creating toxic cocktails that were far more dangerous than any single source of contamination could have produced. Consider a typical medieval meal: bread made from grain that had been stored in rat-infested silos, ground with stones that contained lead, and baked using fuel that produced toxic smoke. This bread was then served with cheese that had been aged in caves used for waste disposal, alongside meat from animals that had fed on contaminated vegetation and been slaughtered without any health inspection. The meal was washed down with ale brewed from mouldy grain using contaminated water and stored in lead-lined containers. Each component of this meal contained multiple layers of contamination, but when consumed together, these toxins interacted in ways that made them even more dangerous. Lead from the bread containers combined with mercury from the ale production to create compounds that were more toxic than either metal alone. Bacterial infections from the cheese mixed with parasites from the meat to create disease combinations that overwhelmed the human immune system. The cumulative effect of consuming these toxic combinations meal after meal, day after day, year after year, created populations that were essentially being slowly poisoned throughout their entire lives. Medieval people didn't just risk food poisoning from individual meals, they were accumulating toxins in their bodies that affected their health, their mental capacity, and their ability to reproduce successfully. Medieval pregnancy and infant feeding practices represent perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this entire nightmare, because pregnant women and developing children were especially vulnerable to the toxic effects of contaminated food. Yet they received no special protection from these dangers. Pregnant women consumed the same contaminated foods as everyone else, passing toxins directly to their developing babies through the placenta. The foods specifically recommended for pregnant women were often even more dangerous than the general diet. Pregnant women were encouraged to consume large quantities of liver from animals that had been grazing in contaminated areas, creating concentrated doses of whatever toxins the animals had absorbed. They were given strengthening broths made from bones that had been infected with diseases, and nourishing ales that contained ergot and other toxic substances. Infant feeding practices ensured that babies were exposed to concentrated toxins from the moment they began consuming solid food. The PAP fed to infants was pre-chewed by adults who had oral diseases and dental infections, creating baby food that was essentially concentrated saliva and bacteria from sick adults. The weaning foods given to older infants were often more contaminated than adult food because they were made from ingredients that adults considered too poor quality for their own consumption. Babies were fed porridge made from grain that was too mouldy for bread, and broths made from bones that were too diseased for adult consumption. Medieval children who survived infancy faced a childhood diet that continued the pattern of toxic exposure throughout their developmental years. Children were often given the worst food available, based on the theory that good food was wasted on people who might not survive to adulthood anyway. School children in medieval institutions were fed deliberately unpalatable food that was chosen for its cheapness rather than its nutritional value or safety. Children in orphanages, monasteries, and other institutions consumed food that was often more dangerous than what was available to adult prisoners. The long-term effects of this childhood exposure to toxic food created adults who were physically and mentally impaired by years of nutritional deficiency and toxic exposure. Medieval populations showed signs of chronic lead poisoning, mercury contamination, and other toxic effects that resulted from lifelong exposure to contaminated food. But perhaps the most insidious aspect of medieval food horror was the way that contamination spread through social networks and trade connections, creating systems where local contamination problems became regional or even continental disasters. A contaminated grain harvest in one area could poison communities hundreds of miles away through trade networks that distributed the contaminated grain throughout Europe. Medieval trade routes became vectors for spreading food contamination across vast distances. Merchants carried contaminated foods from one region to another, spreading toxins and diseases far beyond their original sources. Salt contaminated with industrial waste in one region was traded throughout Europe, poisoning communities that had no connection to the original source of contamination. The preservation methods used for trade goods often concentrated toxins rather than eliminating them, creating preserved foods that were more dangerous than fresh foods would have been. Dried meats carried diseases across continents. Fermented foods spread bacterial infections to new populations, and preserved vegetables transported toxic compounds far from their original sources. Medieval monetary systems contributed to the spread of food contamination by creating economic incentives that encouraged the production and distribution of dangerous foods. Contaminated foods were often cheaper to produce than safe foods, making them more profitable and ensuring their continued production and distribution. The lack of quality control in medieval trade meant that contaminated goods could circulate for months or years before their dangers were recognised, by which time they had already poisoned countless people across multiple regions. Medieval religious pilgrimages created another vector for spreading food contamination, as pilgrims carried contaminated foods from their home regions to pilgrimage sites, where they shared meals with pilgrims from other areas. Pilgrimage sites became mixing grounds where contaminated foods from across Europe were combined and redistributed to pilgrims who then carried new combinations of toxins back to their home communities. The foods served at pilgrimage sites were often more contaminated than usual because they were prepared in large quantities using whatever ingredients were available, with no quality control or safety measures. Pilgrims consumed these contaminated foods as acts of religious devotion, believing that their spiritual significance outweighed any physical dangers. Religious festivals created temporary markets, where contaminated foods were sold to crowds of people from different regions, creating opportunities for contamination to spread rapidly through large populations. Festival foods were often more dangerous than everyday foods because they were prepared using elaborate methods that prioritized religious symbolism over food safety. Medieval warfare created additional opportunities for food contamination to spread as armies carried contaminated supplies across vast distances and consumed whatever food they could find in the territories they occupied. Military campaigns became vectors for spreading foodborne diseases and toxic contamination throughout the regions where they operated. Siege warfare created particularly horrific food situations as besieged populations were forced to consume increasingly desperate foods, while besieging armies struggled to maintain their own food supplies over extended periods. The foods consumed during sieges represented the absolute bottom of medieval culinary horror, as people ate literally anything that might provide calories. The aftermath of battles created contaminated food supplies, as scavengers collected food from corpse-strewn battlefields and sold it in markets without any consideration for the contamination it had absorbed from the battlefield environment. Medieval diplomatic feasts created opportunities for political enemies to poison each other through contaminated food, leading to the development of elaborate food preparation rituals that were designed to prevent poisoning, but often introduced new sources of contamination instead. The foods served at diplomatic events were often more dangerous than everyday foods because they included exotic ingredients that had been transported long distances without proper preservation, and because they were prepared using elaborate methods that created multiple opportunities for contamination. Medieval medical practices contributed to food contamination problems by prescribing foods that were inherently dangerous as treatments for various illnesses. Medieval physicians had no understanding of the connection between food safety and health, leading them to prescribe foods that often made patients sicker than they had been before treatment. Medical diets often included foods that were specifically chosen for their bitter or unpleasant taste, based on the theory that effective medicine had to taste terrible. These medical foods often contained toxic substances that were believed to have healing properties but actually caused additional health problems. The preparation of medicinal foods involved no safety testing and often included ingredients that were known to be poisonous but were believed to be beneficial in small doses. Medieval medical theory encouraged the consumption of foods that modern science recognizes as dangerous toxins. Medieval surgical procedures involved giving patients foods that were supposed to help them recover from surgery, but these foods were often contaminated with bacteria and toxins that caused infections and complications that were worse than the original injuries. The foods given to people who were considered mentally ill were often deliberately chosen to be as unpalatable and potentially harmful as possible, based on medieval theories about the connection between diet and mental health that were completely wrong. Medieval dental practices created additional food contamination problems as people with severe dental problems were unable to chew food properly, leading them to consume foods that had been pre-chewed by other people or processed in ways that introduced new sources of contamination. The lack of dental care in medieval society meant that most people had severe dental problems that affected their ability to consume food safely. People with infected teeth and gums contaminated food through their saliva and blood, spreading infections throughout their communities. Medieval food storage in households created environments where contamination was inevitable and often concentrated over time. Families stored food in containers and areas that were shared with other uses, creating cross-contamination between food and non-food substances. Household food preparation involved no understanding of sanitation or cross-contamination prevention, leading to kitchen practices that ensured that dangerous bacteria and toxins spread throughout all the food prepared in medieval homes. The sharing of food within medieval families ensured that diseases and contamination spread rapidly through entire households. Family members shared eating utensils, drinking vessels, and serving dishes without any cleaning between uses, creating perfect conditions for the transmission of foodborne illnesses. Medieval seasonal food cycles created periods when contamination problems were especially severe, as people were forced to consume foods that had been stored for long periods and had become increasingly dangerous over time. Late winter and early spring were particularly dangerous periods when stored foods had reached maximum contamination levels. The transition between seasons created additional food safety problems as people switched from stored foods to fresh foods without any understanding of how to safely make these transitions. The combination of contaminated stored foods with early seasonal foods often created particularly dangerous dietary combinations. Medieval climate variations created additional food safety problems as unusual weather patterns affected food production and storage in ways that increased contamination risks. Floods, droughts, and other weather events created conditions that made food even more dangerous than usual. The Little Ice Age that affected Europe during the later medieval period created food storage and preservation problems that made already dangerous foods even more hazardous. Cold, damp conditions encouraged the growth of molds and bacteria that contaminated stored foods. Medieval food processing technologies were primitive and often introduced more contamination than they eliminated. Grinding, milling, and other food processing techniques used equipment that was contaminated and added toxic substances to processed foods. The energy sources used for food processing often included materials that contaminated food during processing. Water wheels used contaminated water, windmills processed grain that was already contaminated, and human-powered processing equipment introduced contamination through direct contact. Medieval food packaging and transportation containers were made from materials that were not safe for food contact and often contributed their own contamination to the foods they were supposed to protect. Organic containers decomposed and mixed their rotting material with food, while metal containers leached toxic substances into food. The loading and unloading of food containers during transportation ensured that food was contaminated through contact with whatever substances were present in transportation environments. Docks, warehouses, and other transportation facilities were contaminated with industrial waste and organic matter that was transferred to food during handling. Medieval food quality control was non-existent, creating systems where contaminated and safe foods were mixed together without any ability to distinguish between them. Contaminated foods were often mixed with good foods to disguise their obvious problems, creating food supplies where every item was potentially dangerous. The lack of food testing or inspection meant that foods could circulate for long periods before their dangers were recognised, by which time they had already caused widespread illness and death throughout the communities that consumed them. Medieval waste disposal practices created contamination problems that affected food production and storage throughout entire regions. Human waste, animal carcasses, and industrial waste were disposed of in ways that contaminated water sources, soil, and air that were essential for food production. The disposal of food waste created additional contamination problems, as spoiled and toxic foods were often fed to animals that were later consumed, creating cycles of contamination that affected multiple generations of food production. Medieval urban planning created environments where food contamination was inevitable because food production, processing, and consumption areas were located in close proximity to waste disposal sites, industrial operations, and other sources of contamination. The density of medieval cities created conditions where contamination spread rapidly through entire urban populations. Markets, food storage areas, and residential kitchens were located in close proximity to sources of contamination that affected all food consumed within urban areas. Medieval rural food production was affected by contamination from urban areas, as agricultural areas received runoff from cities that contained human waste, industrial waste, and other toxic substances. Rural food production areas became contaminated with urban waste, creating food supplies that were dangerous even before they reached urban markets. The transportation of food from rural production areas to urban consumption areas involved passage through contaminated environments that added new layers of contamination to foods that may have been relatively safe when they left their production areas. Medieval international trade created opportunities for contamination to spread between different regions and countries, as contaminated foods were traded across political boundaries without any quality control or safety measures. The foods that were considered valuable enough for international trade were often preserved using methods that concentrated toxins rather than eliminating them, creating trade goods that were more dangerous than local foods would have been. Medieval exploration and discovery created new sources of food contamination as explorers brought back foods and food preparation techniques from other regions without any understanding of their safety or appropriateness for European populations. The introduction of new foods and food preservation techniques often created new categories of contamination and danger that had not previously existed in European food systems. But even as we reach what seems like the absolute bottom of medieval food horror, we discover that there are still deeper levels of culinary nightmare that we haven't yet explored. The archaeological record continues to reveal evidence of food practices that were even more dangerous and disgusting than anything we've discussed. Recent excavations of medieval kitchens have uncovered evidence of food preparation techniques that involved deliberate contamination of food with toxic substances that were believed to have beneficial properties. Medieval cooks deliberately added poisonous plants, toxic metals, and other dangerous substances to food based on medical and culinary theories that were completely wrong. The analysis of medieval cookbook manuscripts reveals recipes that called for ingredients and preparation methods that would be considered attempted murder by modern standards. These recipes were passed down through generations of cooks who had no understanding of the dangers they were creating. Medieval food preservation experiments created foods that were essentially concentrated poison, as people tried to develop new preservation methods without any understanding of food safety principles. These experimental foods often combined multiple dangerous preservation techniques in ways that created products that were more toxic than any individual preservation method would have produced. The development of medieval distillation techniques created alcoholic beverages that were contaminated with toxic substances from the distillation process itself. Medieval distillers used equipment and techniques that introduced lead, mercury, and other toxic metals into distilled products. Medieval alchemy experiments created foods and beverages that were designed to transmute base materials into gold or to provide supernatural benefits. But these alchemical foods often contained combinations of toxic substances that were extremely dangerous to human health. The foods created by medieval alchemists were often consumed by people who believed they would provide magical or medicinal benefits, leading to poisoning events that were attributed to supernatural causes rather than toxic food consumption. Medieval religious mysticism created foods that were consumed during religious ecstasies and mystical experiences, and these foods often contained hallucinogenic and toxic substances that were designed to induce altered states of consciousness. The preparation of mystical foods involved no safety considerations and often included ingredients that were known to be dangerous but were believed to provide spiritual benefits that outweighed their physical dangers. Medieval folk magic created foods that were consumed as part of magical rituals and folk medicine practices, and these foods often contained toxic plants and other dangerous substances that were believed to have supernatural properties. The foods used in folk magic were often prepared by people who had no understanding of their toxicity, leading to accidental poisoning events that were attributed to magical rather than chemical causes. Medieval experimental medicine created foods that were used in medical experiments and treatments that had no scientific basis, and these experimental foods often contained combinations of toxic substances that were more dangerous than the diseases they were supposed to treat. The development of medieval pharmaceutical preparations created medicinal foods that were essentially concentrated poison, as physicians experimented with toxic substances without any understanding of safe dosage levels or drug interactions. Medieval torture and execution practices involved forcing prisoners to consume foods that were designed to cause maximum suffering and eventual death, creating foods that were deliberately engineered to be as toxic and painful as possible. The foods used for torture were often designed to cause slow, agonizing death rather than quick poisoning, leading to the development of toxic food combinations that prolonged suffering while ensuring eventual fatality. Medieval biological warfare experiments involved contaminating enemy food supplies with diseased materials and toxic substances, creating weapons of mass destruction that were deployed through food contamination. The development of biological weapons through food contamination created new categories of toxic food that were designed specifically to kill or incapacitate enemy populations through deliberate poisoning. And still, even as we explore these darkest depths of medieval food horror, we discover that our journey into this culinary nightmare is far from over. The historical record continues to reveal new evidence of food practices that were even more dangerous and disgusting than anything we've previously imagined. The true scope of medieval food horror becomes clear when we realize that every aspect of medieval life contributed to the creation and perpetuation of food systems that were designed to maximize contamination and danger rather than to provide safe nutrition. Medieval society was essentially a machine for producing toxic food, with every social institution, economic system, and technological development contributing to the creation of increasingly dangerous food supplies. The cumulative effect of all these different sources of food contamination created a medieval world where survival itself required consuming substances that would be considered biological weapons by modern standards. The fact that medieval civilization not only survived but eventually flourished despite these horrific dietary conditions represents one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. But the story of medieval food horror also serves as a cautionary tale about what happens when societies lose their understanding of basic food safety principles. The descent into culinary nightmare that characterized medieval Europe shows how quickly food systems can become dangerous when scientific understanding is replaced by superstition, tradition, and desperation. The lessons of medieval food horror remain relevant today as we face new challenges in food production, distribution, and safety. The medieval experience shows us how important it is to maintain scientific approaches to food safety and to resist the temptation to prioritize economic, religious, or political considerations over human health and safety. The journey through medieval food horror reveals not just the disgusting reality of what our ancestors consumed, but also the incredible resilience of the human spirit in the face of conditions that seem almost impossible to survive. The fact that we are here today is testament to the remarkable ability of our species to adapt and survive even in the most horrific circumstances. So the next time you sit down to a meal, take a moment to appreciate not just the food on your plate, but the centuries of scientific advancement, technological development, and social progress that made that safe, nutritious meal possible. The horrors of medieval cuisine serve as a stark reminder of how far we've come and how much we have to be grateful for in our modern world of food safety and abundance. The medieval period may have ended centuries ago, but the lessons of its culinary nightmares continue to inform our understanding of food safety, public health, and human survival. The story of medieval food horror is ultimately a story of human triumph over impossible odds, and a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds a way to endure and eventually overcome even the most horrific circumstances. And with that, our journey through the most disgusting foods in medieval history comes to an end. But remember, what we've covered today represents just the documented horrors. The true depths of medieval culinary nightmare may never be fully known. The next time someone complains about their food being cold or bland, you can remind them that at least it's not crawling with maggots, contaminated with lead, or preserved in diseased animal fat. If this video has left you feeling grateful for modern food safety standards, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more historical content that will make you appreciate the modern world. And if you're brave enough to learn about other aspects of medieval life that were just as horrifying as their food, check out the video I've linked in the description about medieval medical practices. Trust me, it makes their food look appetizing by comparison. Thanks for watching, and remember, every meal you eat today is a miracle of modern science and civilization. Don't take it for granted.